Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to continue our discussion about the processes of evolution. And one of the things I want to bring up today is this idea of an adaptation. So we throw this term around when we talk about evolution in the sense that adaptations get accumulated within a species over time the longer they spend time in a given environment and so long as that environment stays stable. And that's how they sort of mold and adjust themselves to work best given that set of environmental conditions. So when we talk about an adaptation, we're talking about some sort of structure, function of a structure, or in some cases, behaviors. I'm going to put a caveat on that behavior there because this stuff all has to be genetically controlled. So it's not a behavior in the sense that you can learn how to adapt to some sort of situation. It has to be something that is just innate, meaning that that organism is born knowing how to do that particular behavior. So just be careful with that one. Um, Regardless, an adaptation is something that's going to enable the species as a whole to survive. What that means is that the individuals in that population who have this particular structure, or a particular structure has this given function, that is going to allow that individual to better survive and reproduce. Remember that reproduction is very key here. Also reproduce better than individuals who are lacking that structure or lacking that function for that structure, so on and so forth. So one of the things that students ask on occasion is just how quickly do these adaptations accumulate in a species? How quickly does evolution take to happen? And we often kind of just throw out there, well, it takes a really long time. And that's true, but the actual rate of adaptation gets tied into a lot of things. One of which, when we want to talk about how quickly evolution occurs, we have to talk about the rate of reproduction. If I want to look at how quickly evolution is happening in a given population, I also need to know how quickly that species reproduces. Um, if I'm looking at something like E. coli, right, a bacterial species, it's possible for that bacterial species to exhibit evolution within a few weeks or within a few months. So there's a lab that the AP students do where they develop a micro environment for these bacteria and they get them to evolve or at least start evolving based on a set of um, antibiotic pressures, antibiotic presence within 2 weeks. But that's also because those E. coli, given the best set of conditions, best nutrients, best temperature, so on and so forth, are capable of making a new generation, making offspring every 20 minutes, right? And most bacterial species, even under relatively okay conditions, can make the next generation within a few hours. So we are able to witness that evolution in relatively short periods of time because that time scale is what we work off of. Um, on the other hand, if you look at something like us as humans, well, we're going to talk hundreds of thousands of years of evolution before we can see really noticeable changes because it's going to take a human 15, 20 years to reach sexual maturity. And we can only make one offspring at a time, or on occasion, two, maybe rare, three offspring at a shot. Um, so the amount of generations that need to occur in order to see that change probably isn't all that different from the number of generations that a bacterial species goes through. It's just that the recycle rate, right? The generation time, the time that it takes to get to that next generation is much longer in a human than it is in a bacterial cell. So there's one piece to keep in mind. Um, the other question is how do those adaptations get there in the first place? Well, a lot of them are mixing up of genetic information, so sexual reproduction is required in order to do that. how many times you make the next generation, how many offspring you make at once, all plays into the role of how quickly adaptations can accumulate. Um, Mutations may play a role in that in most species, even bacteria for that matter. The mutation rates are relatively low. Your cells have evolved pretty good ways to proofread and make sure that mutations aren't occurring on the regular. So just getting those accidental mutations to occur isn't common, so that's going to take time. And then you've got to take into account the environmental factors that are present. How strong of a change is occurring, the stronger the selective pressure, right? The quicker the change is happening. So long as the species can keep up with that change based on the traits that they have in their population, then the quicker you can cause that evolution to occur. If they're relatively slow changes that are occurring, minor changes that are happening, then it's going to take a much longer time for those changes to happen. So again, we're really getting at this idea of natural selection, right? This is what is the driving process behind evolution itself. And again, it's the survival and reproduction. Circle it, highlight it, star it. This is a really big piece because it's not just about survival, it's about reproduction. Because when we talk about the ability for an organism to be fit for its environment, when we talk about its fitness, it's not just about surviving, it's about producing offspring. And you are more fit the more you are able to produce more offspring than another individual with their set of traits in your environment. So, for example, if I take a look at something like a mule, right, which is a cross between a horse and a donkey, that mule is incredibly strong, relatively quick, um, lots of brute strength. So you would think, oh, that's got to be a really fit organism. And in our definition of physical fitness, that's true. But when we're talking about evolutionary fitness, here's the caveat because those mules are sterile. They can't create more of themselves. And so they fail this reproductive piece. And as a result, from a biological standpoint, from an evolutionary standpoint, that organism has a big fat zero as far as a fitness scale. It's terrible. And it's not because it's not big, it's not because it's not strong, it's not because it's capable of living a really long time. It's because it's not capable of producing offspring like itself. And that driving force needs to be the inheritance of those genetic traits in order to continue allowing the shift of characteristics to be more like that organism in every generation. So, fitness is a really big thing. And it's not just about survival, it's about reproduction. And you've got to be able to out reproduce and pass on your genes more often um, and then someone else so that the next generation looks a little bit more like you. And the same thing continues to happen generation after generation. So we go back to some of those major principles of evolution and natural selection. And because it's driven by reproduction, I need that population to produce more offspring than my environment can support. If everybody has equal access to resources because it's a low population size, then nobody's competing for anything. Everybody's surviving, everybody's reproducing. And that's not really what's going to drive natural selection. I've got to have competition there in order for somebody to outcompete somebody else because of the set of traits that they have are more adaptive for their current environmental conditions. So there has to be that unequal ability to survive and reproduce. That's what's going to lead to those gradual changes over many, many generations. And again, it has to be genetically controlled. So those organisms have to have genetic variation, not just something that they happen to have acquired over time. That's where Lamarck failed, remember? So those genetic variations have to exist and they have to favor the survival of one set of organisms over somebody else. And so that favored set of traits are the in those organisms are the ones that are reproducing a little more often, passing those traits on a little more often, so that over successive generations, we see a little bit more like them than we do of the ones that were a little less adaptive. So when we look at something like these five canine species, right, they all came from a common ancestor, an initial canine species that existed thousands to millions of years ago. But as that ancestral canine moved into these different environments, different traits were more adaptive in those environments. And so there was just natural variation within that ancestral canine population. We moved into places in Africa, wooded areas, tundra-like areas, and different sets of traits were more beneficial in those environments. And so the organisms that had the better set of characteristics in the environment, given where they were the ones who survived, who reproduced more often, until the vast majority of their population looked like them because of the set of traits that they had were successful based on the environmental conditions that were present. So this is an interesting example of natural selection in action that we have actually been able to witness within our own lifetime. So we're looking at the evolution of insecticide resistance. And it is natural selection by definition. So take this a step back, an insecticide is something that a farmer may spray on his crops to kill off pests, insects that are typically going to go in and destroy those crops. So here becomes the problem, however. We take a look at an initial population, and there's going to be a range of susceptibility to that particular insecticide. So some are going to be really susceptible to it. It's going to not take a whole lot to kill them off, but you're going to have a handful of individuals in that population that are a little bit more resistant to it. So every time we go in and spray an application of insecticide, you're going to kill off a good chunk of these guys because they're sensitive to it. But the ones that you leave behind that are just a little bit more resistant are going to survive, are going to reproduce, and you're going to create more of a population that is resistant. So the next time you spray, it's going to take a little bit more to kill off what your pest is because you're going to increase that resistance. Next time that happens, it's going to take a little bit more. And so you get to the point where you are spraying so much pesticide and it's being so ill affected that it basically renders itself useless over a certain number of generations. We see the same thing with antibiotics. We can see development of antibiotic resistant bacteria within a few months to a few years of application because we're using it so widespread. And if we don't use it effectively, it becomes a huge problem. Penicillin was the first antibiotic discovered, and we saw resistance strains of bacteria to penicillin within the first year of its existence because we were using it so heavily to treat everything. So we have to be much more selective in using the right antibiotics against the right bacterial species, using the right dosage for the right period of time um, in order for it to minimize the amount of resistance that appears. We've got to be able to kill off that entire population that's causing the infection in your body and not just kill off most of it, because that's where that resistance increases. The potential for that antibiotic resistance increases, and the same thing would be the case here with these pesticides. So just sort of bringing this full circle again, your Darwin's finches, right, are just another example of natural selection. So remember, Darwin found these finches on the Galapagos. Once he brought them back home, he started to recognize the fact that their beak shapes were different, and it wasn't because they were different birds, but because they were different varieties of the same bird. And that those beak shapes were directly tied to certain islands because of the food sources that were present. And one might think, well, that's just a fluke, right? Darwin just happened to come across this. It just happened to work this way, but it doesn't work like that anymore. And that's not true. There have been numerous studies since, even on these same bird populations. And this one just happens to look at a relatively short period of time where they could see changes in the way that this was evolving. based on dry and wet seasons in beak shapes, particularly on bird species that were those seed eaters. So they were looking at the beak size, basically how thick it was versus time. And any time that there was a dry year, meaning those seeds would have been harder to crack open because less moisture, the beak size increased. As they got more moisture again, beak size actually tapered off a little bit because they didn't need them as much to crack through really tough seeds. The seeds were getting softer. Hit another dry year, we saw another increase in beak size. So it's kind of pretty cool to be able to have watched this thickness of these beaks tied directly to evolutionary change, tied directly to environmental conditions, which is pretty cool.